Welcome back, Spooky Squad. Today we've got a ghost story that's not just your average haunted house tale. Oh no, this story is all about a screaming skull. That's right, a skull that literally screams if you try to move it from its beloved home. And we're not talking about some random cottage in the middle of nowhere. Nope, this is Burton Agnes Hall, one of the most beautiful and historical estates in all of England. Today, we're diving deep into the story of Anne Griffith, the woman who loved her house so much, she couldn't leave it, even in death. We're talking about a ghostly obsession, terrifying screams, and one creepy skull that just won't stay silent. So grab your tea, turn down the lights, and let's get into the chilling legend of the screaming skull of Burton Agnes Hall. Before we get into the spooky part, let's set the scene. Burton Agnes Hall isn't just any old house. It's a stately home, and I mean stately. It was built in the early 1600s by Sir Henry Griffith, who was one of those wealthy types that lived the high life back in the day. You know, the kind of guy who probably had 1 million portraits of himself hanging around the house and more servants than family members. Burton Agnes Hall was designed in a grand Elizabethan style with those tall, sweeping windows, intricate brickwork, and sprawling gardens. It was built to impress, and let me tell you, it did its job. This place looks like it could have come straight out of a BBC period drama. Think Downton Abbey, but with a lot more ghosts and fewer tea parties. It's one of those homes that people still visit today, partly for its beauty, and partly because, well, it's haunted. Spoiler alert, it's not just Anne's ghost who likes to hang around the place, but more on that later. The Griffith family, who built the house, were the original owners, and they were pretty wealthy. They weren't royalty, but they were definitely in the upper crust of society. Sir Henry Griffith was one of those guys who knew how to play the political game and had a knack for staying in the good graces of the monarchy. Building this massive estate was like his way of saying, "Look, I've made it." By the late 1700s, when our ghostly tale begins, the house had already been passed down through several generations of the Griffith family. And this is where we meet our main character, Anne Griffith. So, who was Anne Griffith? Well, by all accounts, she was the youngest of 3 sisters, Frances, Catherine, and Anne. Growing up in such a massive, beautiful home, it's no surprise that Anne developed a deep love for the estate. She wasn't just proud of her family's home, she was obsessed with it. And I'm not talking, I really like my house obsessed. I'm talking about the kind of love where you'd literally want to stay there forever, even if that means haunting the place for eternity. Anne was known to spend her days wandering the grounds, admiring the gardens, and soaking in the grandeur of the estate. She was a bit of a dreamer, someone who saw Burton Agnes Hall as not just a home, but as part of her identity. It was like the house was an extension of who she was. Now, Anne's sisters, Frances and Catherine, loved the house too, but not quite to the same extreme as Anne. They were more practical, more grounded in reality. While Anne was out daydreaming about the perfect life at Burton Agnes, her sisters were more focused on, the actual running of the estate, dealing with finances, staff, and all the stuff that comes with managing a huge property like that. But for Anne, the idea of ever leaving Burton Agnes Hall was unthinkable. In her mind, she was going to spend her entire life there, and maybe even beyond. Little did she know, that's exactly what would happen. So, here's where things take a dark turn. It was a quiet day, and Anne decided to go for a walk. And this wasn't unusual. Anne loved to wander the grounds, exploring the surrounding countryside. She probably thought she knew the area well enough to feel safe. But this walk was different. As she strolled through the peaceful fields near the estate, Anne was suddenly attacked by a group of robbers. These weren't your average petty thieves. They were violent, brutal men who weren't just there to steal, they beat Anne viciously. She was left gravely injured, her body broken from the attack. But in a show of incredible strength, Anne managed to make her way back to Burton Agnes Hall. Can you imagine? The sheer willpower it must have taken for her to drag herself back to the house she loved so much. Even after such a horrific attack, Her only thought was to return home. But her injuries were too severe, and after a few days of suffering, it became clear that Anne wasn't going to survive. Her sisters, Frances and Catherine, were devastated. They did everything they could to comfort her, but there was no way to save her. The doctors at the time, well, let's just say 18th century medicine wasn't exactly what you'd call advanced. There were no emergency surgeries, no life-saving treatments. All they could do was wait. And this is where Anne made her infamous request. As Anne lay on her deathbed, she called her sisters to her side. Weak and in pain, she asked them to promise her one thing, that after she died, her skull would be kept inside Burton Agnes Hall. She wanted her skull to remain in the house forever, so that she could still be there in some way. It wasn't enough for her to be buried in the family plot like everyone else. Anne wanted to physically stay connected to the home she loved so much. Now, I don't know about you, but if my sibling asked me to keep their skull on my fireplace mantle for eternity, I'd have some questions. Maybe a few hesitations? It's not exactly a normal request, but Anne was serious. This wasn't some kind of dying joke. She meant it, and she made her sisters promise. Frances and Catherine were heartbroken. They loved their sister, but the idea of keeping her skull in the house? They weren't about that life. So, after Anne passed away, they did what most people would do. They buried her in the family plot like any normal person. They probably figured that once she was gone, the whole skull thing would just blow over. Oh, how wrong they were. It didn't take long for the peace at Burton Agnes Hall to be shattered. A few days after Anne's burial, strange things started happening. It began with small noises, soft footsteps in the halls, doors creaking open and closed on their own. But it didn't take long for the activity to escalate. Then came the screams. And not just any screams. These were blood-curdling, soul-piercing screams that echoed through the halls of the mansion in the dead of night. Servants were the first to hear them, and naturally, they were terrified. Imagine trying to go about your nightly duties, and suddenly you hear what sounds like someone being murdered in the next room. At first, the family tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was an animal, but the screams didn't stop. Every night, without fail, the house would be filled with the sound of agonizing wails, as if someone was in unbearable pain. It wasn't long before Frances and Catherine realized what was happening. The sounds weren't just random. These were Anne's screams. She was angry, she was restless, and she wasn't going to stop until they fulfilled her dying wish. By this point, Frances and Catherine were desperate. The haunting was getting worse. The screams were louder, more intense, and they echoed through every corner of the house. There was no escaping them. Guests who visited the hall would leave terrified, and even the bravest of the servants were starting to refuse to stay after dark. So the sisters did the only thing they could think of. They decided to honor Anne's request. It was a desperate measure, but at this point, they had nothing to lose. One night, under the cover of darkness, Frances and Catherine went to Anne's grave. They dug up her body, and as unsettling as it sounds, they removed her skull. They took it back to Burton Agnes Hall and placed it inside the house, fulfilling Anne's final wish. And then, just like that, the screams stopped. After Anne's skull was placed inside the hall, the haunting seemed to come to an end. The house was quiet once again. The screams were gone, the eerie sounds stopped, and it seemed that Anne's spirit had finally found peace. But here's where things get even weirder. According to legend, Anne's skull must remain inside the house. If anyone dares to move it, the screams will return. In fact, over the years there have been several attempts to remove the skull. Each time, the same thing happens. The terrifying screams come back, louder and more horrifying than before, as if Anne's spirit is angrily demanding to be left alone. People say that the skull was eventually hidden within the walls of the hall, where it remains to this day. No one knows exactly where it is, but it's there, silently keeping watch over the home that Anne loved so much. So, What about today? Does Burton Agnes Hall still have a haunting presence? According to visitors, absolutely. People who have toured the hall have reported strange happenings, cold spots, eerie feelings, and even the occasional glimpse of a shadowy figure that many believe is Anne herself. Some have claimed to hear faint screams in the distance, as if Anne's spirit is still restless, even after all these years. Others have reported objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut without explanation, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched as they walk through the hall. While the family may have done their best to put Anne's spirit to rest, it seems that she's still very much present. Whether she's guarding the hall or simply making sure her skull stays put, there's no denying that Burton Agnes Hall has a haunting energy that continues to captivate those who visit. Now, let's talk about theories. What's actually going on here? Is this just an old legend that's grown over time, or is there something more to it? Some skeptics argue that the story of the Screaming Skull is just that, a story. They say it's likely a tale passed down through generations, growing more exaggerated with each retelling. After all, the idea of a skull screaming because it was moved, that's pretty out there, even by ghost story standards. But others believe that there's truth to the legend. They point to the fact that many people, over hundreds of years, have experienced the same strange phenomena at Burton Agnes Hall. The screams, the eerie feelings, the ghostly apparitions, these aren't just random occurrences. There's a pattern, and it all seems to point back to Anne and her undying connection to the house. Some paranormal experts believe that Anne's spirit is what's known as a residual haunting. This means that her energy is so strongly tied to the place that it replays over and over, like a loop, even if she's not consciously aware of it. In other words, Anne may not even realize she's haunting the hall. Her energy is just there, embedded in the very walls of the house. Others think it's an intelligent haunting, meaning that Anne's spirit is fully aware and is actively trying to communicate. The fact that the screams stop when her skull is placed in the house suggests that Anne's ghost knows what's happening and is making her demands known. So, what do you think? Is this just an old wives' tale, or is Burton Agnes Hall really haunted by the restless spirit of Anne Griffith and her screaming skull? One thing's for sure, the legend of the Screaming Skull has captured the imagination of generations, and it shows no signs of disappearing anytime soon. If you ever find yourself in East Yorkshire, maybe take a trip to Burton Agnes Hall and see for yourself. But, if you hear any screams in the middle of the night, you might want to just leave the skull alone. Thanks for sticking around for today's ghostly tale. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, share it with your fellow ghost enthusiasts, and hit that subscribe button for more spooky stories coming your way. And hey, if you've got any haunted tales from your own hometown, drop them in the comments below. I love hearing about local legends from around the world. Stay spooky, and remember, when someone asks you to keep their skull after they die, maybe just do it. You don't want to find out what happens if you don't.